Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast concerning a speech delivered by the new NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. As you know, Rutte took over very recently from Jens Stoltenberg, who had held that position for 10 years. And what was striking about the speech in Brussels was his demand, first of all, that military spending throughout NATO be raised to Cold War levels. But even more striking was his essential call for war, that NATO needs to prepare for war against Russia. And again, as you could expect from the media, this just passes by with a mere shrug of the shoulders, and and there's a general approving tone. Um, but the timing of this is quite interesting because, of course, we have Donald Trump, who will become president in a little more than a month. And naturally, uh, there is at least some hope. We're all hoping that the war in Ukraine will be brought to an end. I mean, that may be a very unrealistic hope, but nonetheless, there is at least a hope. So it was very striking that Rutte should deliver this speech and essentially declare that we don't need to be talking about peace. We need to be preparing for war. So I just want to go through some of the points that he made. It was quite a lengthy speech, and here we have uh, this. Where are we? Yeah, here we are, and the title, as always, this is the standard paradox that they like to present. The paradox. Stoltenberg was a great one for the paradoxes. To prevent war, NATO must spend more. Again, it's always given that somehow NATO is in the business of preventing war, whereas, of course, we know that NATO is in the business of waging war, triggering war, provoking war. But NATO, with its nonsensical claim that it's a defensive alliance, wants to use this sort of talk about to prevent war, NATO must spend more. And then here we have Rutte, of course, focusing on Putin. Putin is trying to wipe Ukraine off the map. He's trying to fundamentally change the security architecture that has kept Europe safe for decades. Now, again, note the idea that NATO is in favor of the security architecture is, of course, completely ridiculous because there had been a security architecture that had been the Helsinki Final Act. There had been, a some kind of a policy of détente between the West and first the Soviet Union and then Russia, and it was NATO that chose to destroy that security architecture through massive expansion, through gobbling up Russia's former military allies and turning them into NATO frontline states against Russia. That's what fundamentally changed the security architecture. But again, as always at NATO, they reverse it and suggest that it's Russia that has changed the security architecture. And then he says, and he's trying to crush our freedom and way of life. How is he doing that? How is Russia doing that? Whatever view you may take about the war in Ukraine, how is Russia in any way um, uh, crushing our freedom and the way of life in Brussels. His pattern of aggression is not new, but for too long we did not act. Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and many did not want to believe that he would launch an all-out war in Ukraine in February 2022. So it brings up Georgia, which even the EU was said, it had two reports, the EU published two reports, both of which concluded that the war in 2008 was provoked by Georgian President Saakashvili when he launched an attack against South Ossetia and killed Russian peacekeepers as he did so. And then he says here, Russian economy is on a war footing. In 2025, the total military spending will be 7 to 8% of GDP, if not more. That's a third of Russia's state budget and the highest level since the Cold War. And Russia's defense industry is producing huge numbers of tanks, armored vehicles, and ammunition. What Russia lacks in quality, it makes up for in quantity with the help of China, Iran, and North Korea. Now, what's very important to keep in mind when he brings out these numbers that compare Russia with NATO. Now, NATO has a population 7 times the size of Russia's population. So it's 7 times the size of it. The GDP, the total GDP of NATO is 8 times the total GDP of Russia. 8 times. So when he says, oh, the military saying we were 7 to 8% of GDP, which sounds very chilly, yeah, but the GDP is 1/8 of the size of NATO's GDP. So however much Russia wants to spend on its military, it's still a tiny fraction of what NATO can spend, and indeed does spend. I mean, the United States alone, which is a NATO power and the leading NATO power, the United States alone is a far more formidable military force than Russia is, let alone all the other NATO member states, all of which, 32 of them, whose armed forces are all available for NATO. And then this all points in one clear direction. Russia is preparing for a long-term confrontation. Well, who started the long-term confrontation? It's like, however many times Russia was pleading with NATO not to expand, and however many times they raised the issue of Ukraine in NATO, NATO just went ahead and ignored all Russian entreaties. So who provoked this long-term confrontation? With Ukraine and with us. There's always this we. There is this Rutte, whom nobody has elected, but somehow he's speaking on behalf of us. Hostile actions against allied countries are real and accelerating. Malicious cyber attacks on both sides of the Atlantic, assassination attempts on British and German soil, explosions at an ammunition warehouse in Czechia, the weaponization of migrants crossing illegal into Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland, jamming to disrupt civil aviation in the Baltic region. Now, notice that they say, first of all, assassination attempts. There have been innumerable assassinations on Russian soil. We don't actually know exactly who was behind these assassinations. We have to obviously assume Ukraine, the Ukraine intelligence services were behind it, but the Ukraine's intelligence services are run by the British and the Americans. So again, that whatever terrorist attacks take place on Russian territory, the British and the Americans, probably the French and others, are in some ways involved. These aren't assassination attempts. These are real, actual assassinations. As for all these explosions at warehouses, we don't exactly know what they're about, but the chances are that this has come about because of a large-scale arms smuggling operation. Arms being sent from Western countries into Ukraine and from Ukraine to Western countries. Well, if some of the packing isn't done very safely, then the chances are there will be explosions. You have some artillery shells lying in a warehouse somewhere. There will be an explosion. So the claims, a warehouse blew up in the east of London. This has to have been done by the Russians. Why would the Russians blow up a warehouse in East London? Much more likely is that basically this was unsafe packing of weaponry, of artillery shells, and they blew up, which is what happened in the case of that warehouse in Czechia, where again there was an explosion. There's no Russians involved in it. You just basically was storing ammo, and you didn't provide adequate safeguards. That's what happens. I mean, if you have ammunition just lying around without proper safety precautions, they will explode. Rather than accept the fact that there is this arms trade going on in the West, and that it's actually endangering the lives of the citizens of the West, the easiest thing is, let's blame it all on Russia. Oh, the Russians are doing it. They just go to these warehouses and boom, let's blow up a warehouse. So Rutte goes on, these attacks are not just isolated incidents, they are the results of a coordinated campaign to destabilize our societies, always our societies. We, little old NATO being bullied and pushed around by a country that is 1/7 our size. And they're trying to discourage us from supporting Ukraine. Yes. And of course, in the NATO, discouraging from supporting Ukraine, well, you have politicians in NATO land that enjoy a certain popularity because they want to end the support for Ukraine, and lo and behold, they invariably find themselves in the crosshairs and accused of working for Russia and so on. So we don't have to go to Russia and say, oh, you're trying to destabilize our societies and you're discouraging us from supporting Ukraine. We just had a case in Romania where a candidate was cruising to a comfortable victory, and then the Constitutional Court just stepped in and just canceled the election, unable really to explain in any way why it did so. It just sort of vaguely suggested that Russia is behind it. So it's not Russia's not doing anything. It's the public in Europe that is essentially becoming very skeptical and troubled about this war in Ukraine that is sucking in the neighboring states, and that doesn't seem to have any endpoint. It just there's no prospects of coming to an end, and that's why whether it's in Romania, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, the number of these countries are going to be having elections in the very near future. And in all of these countries, the candidates who want to bring their country's involvement in this war to an end, these candidates are likely to do well. And so again, we're going to have more and more of these hysterical stories about Russian interference and Russian destabilization campaign, and to prevent us from supporting Ukraine. Which, of course, and we do not have to repeat it, but we should at least repeat it. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, It's not a member of the EU. There's no formal treaty obligating us, little old us, from supporting Ukraine. They circumvent our deterrence and bring the front line to our front doors, even into our homes. I don't even know what that means. Anyway, Putin believes that a serious, irreconcilable struggle is unfolding for the formation of a new world order. These are his own words. Others share his belief, not least China. This kind of talk is exactly the talk generated by the NATO gang. When they all trooped off, Carl Bildt and all the rest of them, when they trooped off to Maidan in 2014 and said, this is a civilizational struggle. You're either with the East or with the West. And that's exactly what they're doing night after night in Georgia. It's a civilizational struggle. You're either with Russia or you're with us. So again, NATO is always projecting onto others what it is doing itself. Danger is moving towards us at full speed. We must not look the other way. We must face it. What is happening in Ukraine could happen here too. So here we are in little Belgium, and the Red Army is apparently going to make its move against Belgium. Again, we hardly need add that Russia has been struggling for almost 3 years now to make very much progress in the Donbass. Quite how it's going to go from there through Poland, through Germany, and into Belgium, how that's going to be accomplished, is left unclear. But it's very good to create this anxiety. We are all in real danger. It could happen to us. And regardless of the outcome of the war, we will not be safe. We will not be safe in the future unless we are prepared to deal with danger. Because we are in the crosshairs of Moscow. This is a sort of nonsense that wasn't even peddled during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was a far more formidable power than Russia was. But nobody said that Belgium is somehow in danger from the Warsaw Pact. But so this is this vast exaggeration of a threat, hyperventilating about a threat in order, obviously, to justify enormous expenditures on the military. So that's Rutte and Boris Pistorius in Germany, along with Friedrich Merz in Germany. So we've got to increase our military spending. And of course, that is always very dangerous, because once you do that, then the pressure arises where you have to deliver something. You have to actually show that it's necessary to spend this kind of money. And that's kind of thing that leads to war, because otherwise the public will say, well, why are we spending this money? I mean, this is hard-earned taxpayer money, which could easily be and more usefully spent on other things, is being diverted to the military. Well, then you have to justify it, and the only way to justify it is through war. So NATO would say, oh, yeah, let's increase our spending, but that's in order to avoid war. Yeah, we're going to spend a lot more on the military, but that's just a way of preventing war. No, of course not. It's a way of guaranteeing that there will be war, because you have to demonstrate the necessity of this military spending. And as Putin has often said in the past, he quoted Chekhov's famous saying that if in the first act, you see a gun hanging over the fireplace, that means that gun is going to be used in the third act. I mean, that's an obvious point. It's not just there as decoration. You're going to use this. So again, it's the NATO lie that somehow it's a peace-loving organization, that somehow it's defensive. So it increases its military expenditures, but it's purely defensive. It's not going to use any of these weapons. We can do that. We can prevent the next big war on NATO territory. This requires us all to be faster and fiercer. It is time to shift to a wartime mindset and turbocharge our defense production and defense spending. Let's read that again. This requires us all to be faster and fiercer. It is time to shift to a wartime mindset. So it's not even, it's not saying, oh, well, let's go back to the Cold War. We need to have a wartime mindset. But it's all for peace. We have a wartime mindset, but that's just peace. To governments, I say, give our industries the big orders and long-term contracts they need to rapidly produce more and better capabilities. Give us long-term contracts or give us death. Buying only big-ticket items that are delivered too late will not keep us safe. We also need modern capabilities that use the most advanced technologies. We need all of that, and we need them now. So embrace risk and invest in the pool of innovators across our countries. And this brings me to my main point, defense spending. It is true that we spend more on defense now than we did a decade ago, but we are still spending far less than during the Cold War, even though the threats to our freedom and security are just as big, if not bigger. How does that come about? How can the threats to our freedom and security are just as big, if not bigger? You don't have to believe that there was ever really a Soviet threat during the Cold War, but at least the Soviet Union was a very serious military power. Its conventional forces were greatly superior to NATO's conventional forces. And as a nuclear power, it was the equal of the United States. So, at least at the time, it was, perfectly credible to claim that, well, the Soviet Union that's a big, scary country, and we need to spend our quite a bit of money on our military in order to be able to cope with this big, scary country. But Rutte will have us believe, even though the threats to our freedom and security are just as big, if not bigger. So Russia, a country, as I said, I'll say it again, 1/7 the size of NATO by population, and 1/8 the size of NATO GDP, is a huge threat to NATO. And again, a Russia that is still bogged down in Ukraine after 3 years. During the Cold War, Europeans spent far more than 3% of their GDP on defense. With that mentality, we won the Cold War. Why would, I mean, this is the sort of nonsense that they somehow won the Cold War. First of all, they didn't win the Cold War. The Soviet Union decided, backed up, and didn't want to do it anymore. It didn't back up and decide that they didn't want to do it anymore because it was so terribly frightened of NATO. of 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 Belgium and Holland and Germany and the rest. I mean, the Soviet Union wasn't afraid of that. But somehow, this is NATO always does these victory laps. We won the Cold War. We Spending dropped after the Iron Curtain fell. The world was safer. It is not anymore. A decade ago, allies agreed it was time to invest in defense once again. The benchmark was set at 2%. By 2023, NATO allies agreed to invest at least 2%. I can tell you we are going to need a lot more than 2%. So this is the big, we're going to really throw our resources into defense spending. Again, it's not defense, it's a military spending. And again, we have to repeat all of the conflicts that we've had since the fall of the Berlin Wall have all been triggered by NATO and by an aggressive NATO. The bombing of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the bombing of Serbia, the bombing of Libya, the war that was triggered in Georgia, and then, of course, the war in Ukraine. They've all been caused by NATO, the defensive alliance. I know spending more on defense means spending less on other priorities, but it is only a little less, just a little. On average, European countries easily spend up to a quarter of their national income on pensions, health, and social security systems. We need a small fraction of that money to make our defenses much stronger and to preserve our way of life. It's preserving. We have to preserve our way of life because somehow Russia threatens our way of life. But of course, we're not going to have much of a way of life if you're going to go and start spending all this money on military hardware, which in any case is all being squandered in Ukraine. Prioritizing defense requires political leadership. It can be tough and risky in the short term, but it's absolutely essential in the long term. Some people will tell you otherwise. They think strong defense is not the way to peace. No, of course it isn't. The more you spend on the military, the more likely it is that you're going to get into a conflict with somebody. I mean, it's always been the case. It's like regular as clockwork. When powers start spending money on their military hardware, then they are heading towards an armed confrontation. They think a strong defense is not the way to peace. Well, they are wrong. And then here we have peace through strength, because without strong defense, there is no lasting security. No, with NATO, with the existence of NATO, an expanding NATO, a belligerent NATO, an armed to the teeth NATO, there is no lasting security. And without security, there is no freedom for our children and grandchildren. No schools, no hospitals, no businesses. There is nothing. So it's our grannies. We have to worry about our grannies and our grandchildren, all of whom are under threat from Putin. If we don't spend more together now to prevent war, we will pay a much, 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 much higher price later to fight it. Not billions, but trillions of euros. That's if we come out on top, and that's if we win. So again, you can see here that this NATO Secretary-General, the new man, is calling for war. I mean, the preparation for war and ultimately for war. I mean, he's already invoking the threat to our civilization. We have to spend so much on our military because of this threat posed by Russia. In politics, there is a time to talk, a time to decide, and a time to act. I know politicians talk a lot. That's what I do here today. Doubtless there was laughter. There's always laughter in the audience. They make decisions because Rutte had been in politics for many years. He was a prime minister of the Netherlands for some years. They make decisions when needed, sometimes difficult ones, but to act, people must support those decisions. It's in your hands. Today, I call for your support. Action is urgent to protect our freedom, our prosperity, our way of life. Your politicians need to listen to your voices. So it's calling for the people to pressure the politicians to spend more on the military. Now, this is, of course, complete nonsense because the public is never going to pressure politicians to spend more on the military. First of all, people don't want war. They don't want the stupid wars about issues that they're not concerned with. And people actually prefer their governments to spend money on things that make their lives better and more fulfilling in all kinds of social, cultural programs. They don't want their hard-earned money thrown away on weapon systems. So the idea that the public is going to pressure the governments and say, yeah, you got to divert this money from pensions and social security, you got to spend it on military, it's not going to happen. And Rutte, who's been around in politics for many years, knows it's not going to happen. So he's really talking about this narrow group of elites who just talk among themselves and then they let the public know, oh, we're going to increase military spending and you don't get a say in the matter. Tell them you accept to make sacrifices today. Imagine that the public wants to make sacrifices today because of Ukraine. Imagine that. For Ukraine, they're ready to make these sacrifices so that we can stay safe tomorrow. Tell them they need to spend more on defense so that we can continue to live in peace. So we spend all this on military, and that's the way to live in peace. Tell them that security matters more than anything. So again, NATO provides no security, NATO provides no peace. NATO is a perpetual war machine, continually provoking wars, continually expanding, and then blaming the wars on NATO's adversaries and thereby justifying further military expenditures, further NATO expansion. It really is just like kind of a perpetual motion machine that ultimately just cannot stop. And it provokes wars along its merry way. And so that's Mark Rutte, who I think we can say is not an improvement on Jens Stoltenberg, but he's come out with this call for war on the eve of Donald Trump becoming president. So he's pretty much just saying, no, this is, we don't want to accept any kind of end of a conflict or any confrontation with Russia, which kind of Trump has hinted at that's Trump's interest. No, we got to be thinking about decades of war with Russia. So that's NATO today. Nothing good comes out of NATO, but this is the voice of the new Secretary General. And again, when NATO goes, wars and terrorism follow. Anyway, that was just a short podcast to introduce gagglers to the mindset, to use the words of the new Secretary General, the mindset of NATO. All right, well, thank you very much for watching this, and we'll see you soon. All the best. Bye-bye.